Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I'm here today to do a Friday Reads video where I wrap up the week in reading and talk about any exciting book things that have happened this week. If you would prefer to skip over the chatty portion of the video where we're going to be talking about the Booker Prize Shortlist, which will be announced on Monday, so you might be missing out, but you can skip to the Friday Reads portion by using the timestamp that will be in the description box down below. I finished 4 books this week, and I have 2 on the go. So this is a big week for books for me, just as it was a big week for book news, because we got the long list for the National Book Award for Fiction. I did a video today as I'm filming this, which is Friday the 13th. I didn't want to film 2 videos in the same day. That's just kind of the way things ended up happening, which means I'm going to try to do this whole video in one take. And we'll see how that goes, because it's late in the day for me and I want to try to get this done and get the week locked up. I will note I am going to be awful at responding to comments because on Saturday we are going to be doing like a day trip. So I probably won't have access to comments during the day when my Friday Reads videos usually post. So I apologize if I fall behind. It's probably just what's going to happen. But I am probably going to talk about the other long lists for the National Book Award next week in Friday Reads, because I didn't get a chance to actually look at them before I started filming this video. And I decided I wanted to devote the chatty portion to the Booker Prize, not just to talk about what might make the shortlist, but because I follow the Booker Prize on Instagram and they created a broadcast channel which shows up sort of like messages. And it's really interesting. They sent some messages today, basically reminding people that the shortlist will be announced on Monday. And they included a look into the judging process that I found fascinating. And I feel like it ties in with the video that I posted last Sunday about the Pulitzer Prize, and some ways I feel like it could potentially be improved, specifically the idea that I think the Pulitzer board should yield control of who the winner is to the jury that actually reads through the submitted books. And the Pulitzer board should then act as a sort of guide, helping them define what a Pulitzer book is, what it should be, and how they should help reach a conclusion about who the winner should be. And this really ties into that. So let me read to you what they said. Several years ago, we stopped using the phrase literary fiction altogether. Great writers work in many forms, and the notion of whether something was or wasn't a Booker book was holding judges back. Now we tell each judging panel as they begin their work that there is no such thing as a Booker book, because it will be whatever their collective tastes make it. Crime novels, sci-fi novels, graphic novels, novels that are interlinked short stories, and novel-length poems have all been longlisted in the last few years. I love that. I think that is so great. I think that's kind of the way juries for book prizes should be thinking about things. And I think that is something that has hampered Pulitzer juries recently, because I think Pulitzer juries, it feels like they're trying to be tastemakers more than they're trying to just recognize what the best fiction is and try to decide what they think other people should be reading. And it hasn't really worked great, in my opinion. So let's skip ahead a little bit. They talk a little bit about the International Booker Prize, and then they say, for both prizes, what the judges are looking for are excellent works that reward rereading. It is an act of judgment, of course, but they embark on it more as a quest. Each panel meets once a month for 10 months, and by the time they get to the winner meeting, they have read the shortlisted titles 3 times. Some of the books deepen on rereading, others don't. The 2 Booker Prizes are the only ones that work like this. The judges are trying to identify future classics, so the books have to stand up to the rereading test, but we don't give them any other criteria. Each panel decides the rest of the criteria for themselves. What's interesting is that in each case, every judge will have read a slightly different book from the one the other 4 have read. Their task as readers is to describe the books and see if the others recognize their own experience in the description. They often change each other's minds. Gradually, the best books become richer through the discussion. Aside from adopting an egalitarian attitude to literary form, we also aim to create a trusting environment for the judges. As you all can attest, reading fiction is a very personal experience, and judges often share something of themselves in the process. Making this possible works. Many judging panels have stayed in touch with each other afterwards, and one of them has continued as a book group. I love that. And this is the type of detail that might happen with the Pulitzer, but we wouldn't know because they shroud this whole process in secrecy. So it would be nice to know this, because it creates such a nice feeling to know that the judges got along so well that they continued as a book group. I mean, that is fun. Last year, we had some judges who came to the books more analytically and others who approached them more emotionally. We devised a couple of questions they could ask themselves. What is this book doing? And what is this book doing to me? And to me, this is kind of exactly what I was trying to get at. The idea that the jury has control, but the board is there to help them create a set of guidelines and criteria that will help them identify what books suit the prize and what the winner should be. So I just wanted to mention that because it kind of directly ties to what I was talking about in that video and what I think the relationship between the board for the Pulitzer and the jury for the Pulitzer should be. And it feels like the Pulitzer happens behind closed doors where it's kind of implied that things are contentious and not necessarily friendly. The Pulitzer released a statement, I think it was last year, possibly the year before, where they talked about how the Pulitzer board meets, and then the way they described it, I think, is that discussion is very animated and passionate, which of course sounds argumentative. And I think that's why the Pulitzer has such secrecy about their process, but clearly it doesn't have to be that way. And I would love to see the Pulitzer adopt more of an attitude like this. I think that would honestly be really great. So I saw that this morning and wanted to mention it before diving into a discussion about the shortlist, or what the shortlist could potentially be. Because of quirks of timing, it's just where I am in the world compared to the Booker Prize. It will be earlier in the day for me when they announce the shortlist. So hopefully I will be able to record a reaction to the shortlist and get it edited and posted on the same day. You know, the book season is exciting. It is also a lot of work. And it's just, my mind is reeling a little bit from knowing that I had to film 2 videos today, and then Monday there will be another video I need to try to film and edit and upload in the same day. So I'm going to allow myself a little grace if I can't film it, to maybe not have it done on the day that the shortlist is announced. But that is the goal. Anyway, what could make the shortlist? I should note, I've only read 2 of the books that are on the long list at this moment. And people always get upset because they're like, you can't review books that you haven't read. And I'm not attempting to review the books. You can follow conversation about the book, or you can understand things about the books that are in contention and follow along with people who are reading the long list. And you can make informed decisions about what might possibly fit the criteria that the judges are looking for, the themes that they seem to be looking at, the idea of what books will work on a reread, but since that is something that is important to them, you can do all of that without having read all of the books. I'm not attempting to review them. I'm basically sort of reading tea leaves, and we can leave it at that. I do want to mention 2 channels that I have really enjoyed following the Booker content for. Those are Bob the Bookerer and Roro Reads, even though Roro Reads is not at a fun time with the long list this year. But I have just really enjoyed their perspectives on these books, what they mean, and really great analytical detail about the books and the long lists in general. I'll link both of the channels down below. They are delights. So the first thing I tried to think about in thinking about what might make the shortlist is, are there any books that I feel like are not going to make the shortlist at all? And I only came up with one. That's Wild Houses by Colin Barrett. Basically, just because of what the book is and the reactions from a lot of people who read it, it doesn't feel like it has that sense of heft. And for that reason, I don't know if it would be rewarding on a reread. And a lot of the feedback that I've seen on it has been, well, that was good. What is it doing here, though? Pretty uniformly. So I feel like if any one book is going to not make the shortlist, that's probably the one. Watch Wild Houses make the shortlist now. I will be eating crow for sure. So I started approaching from the opposite direction. What are books that I think are sure to make the long list? And here's where you could really get into your head, because last year I felt extremely certain that Sebastian Barry, Tan Tuan Eng, and probably Ayobami Adebayo were going to make it onto the shortlist, especially Sebastian Barry and Tan Tuan Eng. It felt like those were books that were destined to make it onto the shortlist, and then they didn't. So this actually felt like a very fraught question this year, because that really just goes to show that anything can happen when the shortlist is announced. However, I feel pretty confident saying that James by Percival Everett and Playground by Richard Powers and My Friends by Hisham Matar are very likely to make it onto the shortlist. And that's helpful because that fills half of my potential shortlist. So right away, I only have 3 more books that I need to identify. So I'm going to go with those. I feel like those 3 are interesting in the discussion that I've heard around them. It feels like when you reread them, there would be other angles to consider and things to think about. You could certainly see layers. James, I feel like for sure, because I've read it, I can even see the ways rereading would still be interesting because you can approach from different angles, consider different things, and it would benefit from a sense of rereading, especially if you did it in tandem with The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, but I don't know if they would want to go that heavy on that. So I think I'm going to give 3 slots to James, Playground, and my friend. I'm not so bullish on Playground, but it feels like the booker loves Richard Powers, so I won't be surprised to see it on there. And then I started thinking, well, what are things that could benefit from rereads? And I'm now sort of questioning what my next choice was, which was Wandering Stars by Tommy Orange, because I sort of wonder if you could benefit from on a reread from Held, or Creation Lake, or Enlightenment, or Orbital. Maybe Enlightenment would fall away, but and Orbital, I wonder how that would work on a reread. So I started moving away from Enlightenment and Orbital. I did put Wandering Stars on my list. I am wondering about Held. And I think the Safekeep is interesting because since there is a twist halfway through, which is why you can't really talk about that book in great detail, a reread would be really interesting, sort of like when you watch The Sixth Sense for the first time and then you watch it for a second time, you can sort of play out all of the clues that happen along the way. The Safekeep could do that, which would make a reread really interesting. However, I also think the Safekeep is, the first half is pretty structurally familiar in a way that makes me wonder if it would make it onto the shortlist. I won't entirely be surprised if it doesn't. I'm almost talking myself into replacing Wandering Stars with the Safekeep, but I just don't feel like it's likely. Headshot, again, I feel like on reread, it could still be interesting because, again, if you know who like the winner of this tournament is, you might enjoy seeing the way things play out again. But the way people have talked about that book makes me kind of wonder if that is the type of thing that would happen. So ultimately, I'm sticking with James, Playground, and My Friends. I am going to stick with Wandering Stars by Tommy Orange. And I'm a little torn about the last 2 spots between Held, This Strange Eventful History, Stoneyard Devotional, and maybe Orbital, maybe the Safekeep, maybe Headshot. And honestly, it could go any direction. I am going to say This Strange Eventful History by Claire Messud because the way people have talked about it, even people who don't like it, implies that there are things about it that are interesting enough that on a reread it could potentially work. It seems like the Booker jury is interested in some things that come up in that book, so I'm going to put it on my shortlist. And then maybe out of a sense of my own interest, I'm going to give my last slot to Stoneyard Devotional by Charlotte Wood, because I think a lot of people got to that book later in their journey of reading through the long list. And I've just been hearing a lot of really good things about it the last 2 weeks. And the way people talk about it sounds so interesting that it's made me curious to read it, even though it's not released in the United States at this moment. So yeah, we'll see. But so I'm going with James, Playground, My Friends, Wandering Stars, This Strange Eventful History, and Stoneyard Devotional. I will not at all be surprised if Held in particular ends up making it, but we shall see. We'll see. That's what I'm putting as a short list. I'd love to hear what you think will make the short list in the comment section down below. Now, let's get to the Friday Reads portion of the video, because as I said, I finished 4 books this week, and I have 2 more on the go. So there's a lot to talk about in a Friday Read section. Let's talk about the first book that I finished first, which is Razorblade Tears by S.A. Cosby. Now, when I last spoke to you in a Friday Reads video, I had 150 pages left in this book. So Friday night, after I filmed my Friday Reads video, I read 50 pages. So I knew right away, then and there, if I wade into the last 100 pages, I am going to be stuck. I'm going to want to finish this book, and I'm going to need to finish this book. So that happens a lot of the time when you read something mystery thriller-ish. And I knew it was going to happen with Razorblade Tears. So I chose sleep and went to bed. And then on Saturday, we had company coming from Seattle and spent the morning trying to, get the house ready and all of that. And then Joel, who has read Razorblade Tears and really loved it, did a very kind thing. He said, well, why don't I go to the airport and pick them up? Do you think you can read the last 100 pages in the amount of time it will take for me to get to the airport and back? And I said, I am going to make it work. And this reads so quickly that it ended up not really being a problem. I had only 8 pages left when he got back from the airport with our guest who stayed overnight on Saturday. And of course, I spent about 30 minutes saying hi, getting settled in. But then Joel and this friend, they knew each other when they worked in a restaurant. So they were going to cook dinner together. So as soon as they got into the kitchen, I snuck away and read the last 8 pages of the book. That is how involved I was in this. It was like, I cannot leave this unread or unfinished until Sunday night. I need to get that last 100 pages in. And then when they got back before I finished, I needed that last 8 pages. This was a really good book. It is difficult. So on Sunday, I was actually texting with my sister, one of my sisters, and I was going to say she's squeamish. She's not squeamish. She's a doctor. She can handle, gross things. But she really doesn't like violence in movies or in books or in life, really. So she was asking me if I had read anything good, and I told her I just read a book that I really liked, but you should never in a million years read it. And then I described it to her, and she said, yes, absolutely not. I will never read that book. And that, for her, is correct. It is a really good book, though. And the premise of it is that you have Ike and Buddy Lee, who are 2 men who are ex-cons, and their sons were married. That's the connection between Ike and Buddy Lee. Both Ike and Buddy Lee are ex-cons and have, to varying degrees, reformed their life, especially Ike. Ike is trying to live on the straight and narrow and do better and not get drawn into a criminal way of life. But their sons are murdered. And Ike and Buddy Lee are frustrated because they don't have closure. They are very homophobic. They've had a lot of problems with gay men and had very strained relationships with their sons as a result, and were never able to have a satisfying relationship on both sides. Like, the sons were not satisfied by their fathers, the fathers were not satisfied by their sons. It was just very strained. And now the sons are dead, and there's never going to be closure for them. And I mentioned that this kind of reminds me of Don't Cry for Me by Daniel Black, because it's too late for forgiveness at this point. The best they can do is try to get closure for the murder, and in doing so, apologize for being the bad fathers that they were. And this works on such interesting layers and levels of discrimination and acceptance. And it's a really well-told book. It is very well plotted. One of my problems with mystery thriller type books, and this is classically called like literary fiction, but it does have a lot of thriller aspects. So you could really call it both if you want. And that's kind of why the distinction ultimately to me is kind of meaningless, because it's sort of like what we were talking about with the directions that were given to the Booker jury. What is literary fiction anyway? Like, what a good book can be anything. And anyway, I don't want to fall down a rabbit hole with that. But so this just works on so many good levels. It does so many interesting things, and the characters are really, really great. And it unfolds in very interesting ways, and I really liked it. And I don't want to talk too much about where it goes, but the journey that Ike and Buddy Lee go on almost is like after their sons are gone, they are getting to know them for real for the first time. And that is really interesting. So I really enjoyed this book a great deal. I'm glad I finally read it. I had wanted to read it for like 2 years because Joel read it a while back at this point, and he really liked it. And then I got all into my feelings because then we had a dog who got sick and we lost him. And then we had another dog that got sick and we lost her. So while I was on a grief journey, I didn't feel like I could read a book that is very violent. And if you are squeamish about violence or just don't like violence, this could be a very difficult book for you. You will never look at garden supplies the same way ever again, for sure. So definitely keep that in mind. Part of me almost wonders, because there is definitely an aspect of two fathers who are grieving and trying to accept the loss. Maybe there would have been some catharsis if I had forced myself to read this book, but I think I read this at the time when I was ready, and it was worth waiting for that because I really liked Razorblade Tears, and I would definitely recommend it to you if you can stomach the amount of violence that is in the book. The next book that I finished since we last spoke was Bel Canto by Ann Patchett, and this is something that I was listening to on audio. What's really interesting about this to me is that I have now read 3 books by Ann Patchett. Run, which I didn't like, Tom Lake, which I loved, and Bel Canto, which I wouldn't say I loved, but I really liked. All 3 of those books are set in periods of interruption in normal life. And that is really interesting as a through line for Ann Patchett. And I don't know if it would hold up if I read, say, The Dutch House or Commonwealth, but it is very interesting that the first 3 books I have read by her all have that feature in common, where normal life has been interrupted by something to varying degrees. And there's a sense of being in limbo and almost in suspense because you don't know when things are going to get back to normal and what that will look like and what things will change when you do resume normal life. Basically, in Run, which is the one that I didn't like, there is an accident. Someone is injured in the accident and is in the hospital, and you are sort of waiting to find out if they are okay, if they are not okay, and that person's child is temporarily in the care of another family. So there's a sense that you don't really know what's going to happen, if they're going to be okay. And if they are okay, like, what's recovery going to look like? Normal life has been interrupted and you don't know when it's going to resume. Tom Lake is set during the pandemic, and you have a family who are all back on their cherry farm, and it's a lot more friendly because the sense of interruption is that they are all back in the same place because of the pandemic. And because of the way time moves along and families change, kind of like Sandwich by Catherine Newman, there's a sense that this is probably the last time that they will all be together like this again, because life is inevitably going to change. They're going to start getting married. The daughters are going to start getting married. They're going to start having kids. And it will be more difficult to bring people together like that. And if you do bring people together like that, husbands or grandkids will start coming along. And it's not that that's a bad thing, but it's different. And of course, in the pandemic or the early days of the pandemic, you didn't really know if normal life was ever going to come back or when it would, and if there would be sort of lingering things that would come from it. So that's the sense with those books. And that takes us to Bel Canto, where you have people in an unnamed South American country, and there's a hostage crisis. People, revolutionaries, break in thinking that they are going to kidnap the president, but the president of this unnamed South American country is not there. He decided not to come at the last minute. But the vice president is, and there are some important figures. There's a Japanese businessman, and a famous opera singer named Roxanne Koss is there. And they end up holding all of these people hostage for a long time. And it's based on a real life incident that took place for over 100 days. I can't remember the exact amount of days. And this sort of mimics that structure. So you have these people who are living in this limbo space where they are in the vice president's house, which is a very surreal thing because it's not like, it's a very, opulent. It's designed and sort of staged to be nice and accommodating, but it's also temporary. And you're kind of forced to live outside of like bedrooms and spaces. There are a lot of people who are like sleeping on couches, and there are a lot of people who are mingling over the course of this hostage crisis that wouldn't usually be mingling. And you're outside of normal society. You don't have that much access to news and what's going on in the world. So you are living life in a community as you ordinarily would, but you don't, the standard operating rules of society are no longer there. You have new people who are in charge, and over time they become friendly with the guards and get to know them and develop relationships with them. And you begin to talk to, like, Roxanne Koss, as a famous opera singer, probably wouldn't mingle with a lot of the people at this party, especially the revolutionaries who come from more poor backgrounds. And distinctions of class still exist, but they mostly evolve into new structures or power structures. And it's very interesting from that perspective. And the fact that all three Ann Patchett books that I've read have this thing in common where they take place when normal life has been interrupted, is just fascinating to me. And it makes me want to read another one of her books to see if that continues. I doubt that it will, but it is interesting that 3 for 3, I've run into that. I do think the book has a bit of a slow start. I don't think it's necessarily Ann Patchett's fault. I think it takes a lot of time, as I said in my last Friday Reads, to put all of the chess pieces down onto the table. It takes a lot of time to get that set up. Once you have settled into this world where you have hostages and hostage takers living together, getting to know each other, and almost creating their own little world outside of the regular world, the book really starts to take off, and you get to know some of the characters and who they are and what they stand for. And it builds to something. It does. The ending, it kind of happens. I can't really talk about the ending. I will say, because you do start to get attached to things, there's emotional resonance in the conclusion, and because you know that this togetherness is temporary, because out in the real world, what's going to happen to the people who took them hostage, and even people who begin to develop relationships with other people who have been taken hostage, they're going to go back to the world. What is going to happen with that? So you know that everything is fleeting and temporary. So there's a sense of resonance, even though you know that this is a very fleeting scenario that they are living in. And at the same time, I think over time, this is not a book that's going to sit with me in the same way that Tom Lake did. I enjoyed it. I liked it. I find it interesting more than I am emotionally attached to it, if that makes sense. So I'm glad that I read it, but I don't think it's going to live in my soul the way Tom Lake ultimately did. But I do think it's very interesting. So that was that one. Then I started Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin on audio, and I very quickly abandoned it. Now, usually I wouldn't even talk about the book in this type of circumstance, but I had mentioned that it was lined up as something that I might get to next, and some people were excited about it. And so rather than keep everybody in suspense about whether or not I did read it, I felt like I should mention. I started the first chapter, and I read a Gabrielle Zevin book in the past, and I really didn't like it. So I feel like maybe I'm just not ready to try one of her books again. Maybe, and then in the first chapter, it felt like, okay, so she's just doing John Green, basically. So I feel like I was going in on guard, ready to not like it. And that's not fair to the book, and it's not fair to me either. And it's not fair to you, because you wouldn't get an accurate perspective of the book. I know a lot of people have liked Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. I could tell if I forced myself to read it, I was going to be annoyed. So I put it down and didn't go any further with it. Then, in print, once I finished Razorblade Tears, I decided to lean into Shorty September. And I started Franny the Queen of Provincetown by John Preston. This is sort of like a series of vignettes, which is actually going to tie into the next print book that I picked up as well. Franny is a drag queen it was written in the 1980s. And Franny is someone who witnesses police intimidating queer people, and keeping them from going to a bar that they had gone to be themselves and to find joy in their lives. And Franny becomes someone who is very protective of other members of the queer community and wants to help them realize who they are. And I think I might have one of the most interesting things bookmarked, where Franny becomes an advocate for living authentically and radically yourself and dealing with your trauma and trying to live a better life and be more you. And in this one, someone they know is hiring someone, and they don't think they can hire a person who is flamboyantly, like, obviously gay. And Franny says, "You have no right to make that boy go through what happened to us. You are no better for all those tears and all those names they called you all those times you've been so frightened. You are not better. You're scarred. You have no right to turn around and leave a scar of your own on one more person to make it even, not on someone as young and full of trust and hope as him." So there's a really beautiful through line in these stories where Franny is becoming an advocate for healing and community and trying to push forward and recover from a lot of the pain and the shame that you have been taught as a member of the queer community to just inhabit yourself. And I don't usually tab books, but I did tab this. The one thing I will say is it's very short. Now, unfortunately, John Preston did die of AIDS, complications from AIDS in 1994, I think. And he had been in the process of writing a sort of sequel. He did make edits to this book, and that is the revised edition is in here. But basically, he had used strong language, and he decided that the strong language, I can only imagine what it is, detracted from the story. So he decided not to use it. And that is what this edition of the book reflects. It's very short. Like, the book itself does not actually start until almost page 30, and then the book itself is only until page 117, and that includes elements of the sequel. So that's how short this is. And then the rest is appendices, and the appendices are actually fascinating as well. So I enjoyed it. It does feel a little bit slight, but I love the message of the book and what it is saying about community and progress and accepting of yourself and not beating down other members of your own community. So it's a little sad that John Preston didn't have the time and ability to expand that second part that he wanted to add, but I'm really glad that I read this. And if you can track down a copy, it would be a perfect book for Shorty September. That takes me to The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros. So I've really been leaning into Shorty September, in case you can't tell. And this is another one that is sort of vignettes. I had read this about 20 years ago, and a lot of it had faded from my memory. And this is another book that is told in vignettes. So not only is it a short book, it's very quick to read because this is the introduction. And then once it starts, you get quick little bursts of chapters. And again, they're sort of vignettes. So through the vignettes, these short little chapters, you get a sense of the protagonist, Esperanza, who has just moved into a house on Mango Street with her family. And they had dreamed of having a house, but this is not the house that she had envisioned. It's not the sort of perfect, like, white picket fence type house that she had in her mind when they talked about wanting to have a house and settle down in the future. She lives in an area that, one of the first things that happens is she meets a white neighbor, and the white neighbor talks about how she's moving away because a lot of bad elements are moving in, completely oblivious to the fact that Esperanza is one of those bad elements that is moving in, and she is going to try to get away from. So there are a lot of things that happen in this book. And as Esperanza gets older, she meets other people in the neighborhood, and you learn a lot of the stories of these people who are growing up on the fringes of, like, white society and the ways they are treated. And as she gets older and her friends get older, Esperanza discovers the male gaze and what it does to people. There is sexual assault, so trigger warnings. It's a beautiful book. I think because it's short and the vignettes kind of similar to this, but more, I would say it lands a punch a little better than Franny the Queen of Provincetown, although I really loved Franny the Queen of Provincetown. It does ultimately feel a little slight to me. So I kind of see how over the course of 20 years, I forgot a lot of details, but I'm really glad that I revisited it. And that just means in 20 years, I'll get to revisit it, read it again, and sort of rediscover it all over again. So I'm really glad that I did that. And the next one, so wait, is that the four? Those are the 4 books that I finished. Let's talk about what I'm currently reading. Now, I almost did this one in print, and I ultimately decided to start it on audio. I got it from the library, and then it's Nicked by M.T. Anderson. And basically, I got it from the library and then decided I wanted to do Shorty September. So I did Franny the Queen of Provincetown. And then because I had already cashed in a credit on Libro to get Nicked on audio, I decided to continue with Shorty September and do The House on Mango Street. This is such a fun book. And I heard M.T. Anderson do an interview with NPR's Book of the Day podcast. And then I saw someone from a bookstore somewhere, they posted it on Threads. They said that this book is like watching The Mummy with Hilary Mantel providing commentary. And try not to be fascinated by that. And the book really lives up to that. It's an adventure story, but it's got all of the, intellectual heft, because you don't need intellectual heft to enjoy an adventure story, but if you're looking for that, it is here. So this is a heist story that begins in the town in Italy that my mother's family came from. Now, my mother and her family refer to this city as Bari. Here it is, Bari. But the narrator of the book calls it Bari. And I don't know, maybe my mother and her family just say Barry. But so I don't know if that's the actual way to pronounce it. But yeah, so it starts there. You have a monk named Nicephorus who has a dream about St. Nicholas. Yes, the St. Nicholas from Christmas. But back then, St. Nicholas was mostly known as the patron saint of travelers. Like if you were someone who would be sailing the Mediterranean, you would pray to St. Nicholas. And Barry has been experiencing plague, and Nicephorus has this dream about St. Nicholas, and he tells his boss, basically, about his dream, and the boss decides this is a sign. St. Nicholas is unsatisfied where his body currently rests. So they decide they're going to hire this mercenary. He's like a relic hunter, essentially. And when I say relic hunter, understand the original meaning of relic hunter, which is religious relics, artifacts from the apostles or the saints or, Jesus himself, that are supposed to have miraculous properties. The body of St. Nicholas is supposed to ooze this bilious secretion that has amazing healing properties. And you can kind of see on the cover of the book that this skull has a little bit of ooze coming out from the eye socket. So relics could go, there were a lot of counterfeits and fake ones, and there was a lot of belief empowered in them, if that makes sense. So the people that Nicephorus works for decide that they're going to hire this relic hunter named Tune. And in order to keep him honest, two people from the monastery are sent with him. And of course, one of them is Nicephorus, who is a very honest and earnest person. He's sort of incapable of lying. And as he goes on this journey with Tune, he gets to know the people on the ship. He gets to know Tune's worldview. Tune is a very mercenary person and thinks about the world in terms of dollar signs and how he can use things to his advantage. So there's a very interesting play between the two of them. And I am halfway through the audio at this point, but this is such a fun, interesting book. It plays with ideas of religion and talks about religion as a sort of fairy tale, which is like, if you're a religious person, that is great. I am not particularly religious, to be honest. And my grandmother had one of those children's Bibles that she would read to me from before bed. And this is, I think it's funny, but it's true. This is how I thought of it. I couldn't distinguish between the Bible stories in that book and the fairy tales that my mother or my father would have been more likely to read me. Like if you read to me about a story about like Jason and the Argonauts, which is not a biblical story, but anyway, point just being, I couldn't differentiate between the stories from the Bible and fairy tales. And this book, if you are religious, I mean, I don't know how it ends. So, but if you are someone who is a little more religious, it talks about a lot of elements of like the relics and how important they were. If you're a history nut, there are a lot of fascinating angles to consider, but it talks about it as if it's sort of like an adventure story or a fairy tale. And I'm really enjoying it. It's a lot of fun. So I can't wait to finish this and talk to you more about it when I am done, which will be next, should be done soon, hopefully. So once I finished The House on Mango Street, I decided to lean into another shorty. And I had held up my pile of possibilities on Instagram and sort of asked people what I should read. And no one voted for Franny, the Queen of Provincetown, by the way. I chose to do that one on my own. And then the books that got the most votes were The House on Mango Street and The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie by Muriel Sparks. So I decided I would read the Franny, the Queen of Provincetown for myself, and then I would read House on Mango Street and The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. And I am halfway through this one. I have seen the movie several times. Maggie Smith is amazing in it, but I haven't read the book. Basically, Miss Jean Brodie is a teacher in Edinburgh in the 1930s. She is very unorthodox. She teaches at a school called the Marcia Blaine School for Girls, and she will adopt a small group of students from within her class, and they are known as the Brodie set, and she will try her best to teach them, but not necessarily the approved academic curriculum of the school. She will teach them about artists and the world and love and self-care and all of those things. She's a very outsized personality. And with the first time I saw the movie, I did not know what to expect. So I thought it was just a movie about a great teacher, kind of like, Dangerous Minds, or what's the Sidney Poitier teacher movie? I don't know why I can't think of the name of that movie, but that one, like, I thought it was going to be one of those great teacher movies. So I watched it, and then I was confused when I got to the end, because I was like, I don't know about this relationship she had with her students. But then I sort of realized the point is that maybe she's not the best influence for these kids, and maybe her methods were a little too unorthodox. So it's sort of interrogating on a much more complex level than just trying to tell you, here's a great story about an inspirational teacher who really had an impact on. She does have a huge impact on the lives of her students, not always in the best of ways. So it's a very fascinating story. And I picked this up in Edinburgh when we were there, which seems 100% appropriate because the Marcia Blaine School for Girls is in Edinburgh. So I got this at Topping and Company, which is a beautiful bookstore. If you are ever in Edinburgh, please make a trip. So I can't wait to be done with that. So when I finish The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie and when I finish Nick, I think I know what my next audiobook is going to be. I will wait to talk about that. When I finish The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, I do have 2 library books, but I think I'm going to pick at least one more shorty before I pick up one of the library books. Let's talk about my pile of possibilities. So I have added to this since I held it up on Instagram. The books that I have put on my pile of possibilities are Winter in the Blood by James Welch, Waiting for Eden by Elliot Ackerman, The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea by Yukio Mishima, translated by, it doesn't have the name of the translator on the cover, which is always a little bit annoying. Translated from the Japanese by John Nathan. Nocturnes for the King of Naples by Edmund White. The Burrow by Melanie Cheng, which is actually not out yet. This will be released on November 12th from Tin House. It sounds fascinating, and I would love to read it. And because it is under 200 pages, it feels like this would be a good time to do it. Attic by Catherine Dunn. I have read Geek Love and haven't read anything else. I've heard very mixed things about Attic. It is a stream of consciousness book, but I feel like Shorty September would be a natural point to sort of pick it up and try to make it fit. This looks like a book that is well over 200 pages, but it is actually a collection of 3 books by Roddy Doyle: The Commitments, The Snapper, and The Van. It's the Barrytown trilogy. So if I pick this one up, I would just be reading The Commitments. Kind of like how I'm reading The Country Girls by Edna O'Brien in installments. That would be the same deal. I wouldn't read all of them. I would probably just read The Commitments, and we'll see if I end up doing that this month. And then All We Shall Know by Donal Ryan, another Irish writer, just like Roddy Doyle. So if you have thoughts about one of these, I would love to hear your recommendation for which one I should try to pick up next or prioritize for Shorty September. I've really been enjoying short books. There's a sense of accomplishment that you get from being able to finish something quickly, and I have really just been enjoying that. So Shorty September is really working for me. But let me know if you have recommendations from that pile, and we'll see which one I actually pick up. I do, as I said, have 2 library books. I have one in the house right now, and I think I might lean away and prioritize some other things before I get to that book. And the other one there's a little more urgency. I don't want to get into it because what if I don't end up reading it? I'll end up in a tomorrow scenario again where I feel like I have to tell people what happened with it, and I don't want to do that. I'm also deciding right now I am not going to insert photos of all the books that I don't have with me because I don't want to spend a lot of time editing this video. So that's just the way it is going to be. But I would love to hear what you've been up to this week, what you've been reading, watching, loving, all of that stuff in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.